is. All right. Looks like everything's going. So this is episode 30 of Going South. I'm very fortunate today to be talking to Dr. Robert Jones. He's the founder and CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that does research on kind of the intersection of religion, race, social issues, politics. He's based in DC. He's a Southern guy, though, so this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk with him. They kind of do, I guess, public opinion research as it relates to religion and social issues. He's been a commentator and written for such publications as The Atlantic. He's been on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, been in the New York Times, Washington Post, talking about race. He's probably best known as of late for his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. So I was hoping to talk with him about that today. He's from Mississippi originally. Went to Mississippi College, I believe, but did your divinity work at Candler, is that right, at Emory?
Yeah, I did my MDiv actually at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth.
Sure.
So I kind of joked that I then did my PhD work at Emory there. But I sort of, my joke is I basically lived along Interstate 20.
I got
you know, it was either Jackson or Atlanta or the Dallas Fort Worth area until I was well into my 30s. That was as far north as I'd ever lived.
I got you. How long have you been in DC now?
Moved here in 2005. Yeah, so a while now.
Yeah, gotcha. So what I'd like to do, we talked about this before I pushed record, is just, is it okay if I call you Robby?
Yes, please do.
If you just tell folks a little bit about your background and how you came to write a book about white supremacy in the Christian church and kind of what the PRRI does that's interesting and how those things all tie together. That's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with my day job and the hat that I wear as the CEO and founder at PRRI. That's the Public Religion Research Institute. And what we do is we interview about 100,000 people a year and somewhere around 8 to 10 public opinion surveys where we really are just trying to have our finger on the pulse of what religious Americans are thinking about a whole range of issues. So we're not really an issue specific organization, and I should say we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that is independently funded by foundations. And make all of our work public on our website, and even release our data sets to the public after an embargo of 1 year. But we are really there to as a public service, as a 501c3 organization, and our primary audiences are really journalists and policymakers, and also religious leaders in the general public. And we're just really trying to track demographic changes in the country, what that looks like, and then opinion across a whole range of issues at this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. So that's kind of my day job at PRRI. So that's part of what brought me to write the book, because one of the areas that we're doing a lot of research on is attitudes around race, racism, systemic racism in the country, and as the country particularly is changing demographically. How people are perceiving those changes. Are they welcome changes? Are they changes that cause kind of fear and worry among people? And what does that look like? But this book is also personal, as you said. I'm from the South. I was actually born in Atlanta. Both my parents are from Macon, Georgia, and my family goes back at least 6 generations in either Twiggs County or Bibb County, Georgia. So both sides of my family have been there since the early 1800s. And so, I have that long family history and, can trace it back to kind of, receiving a land grant in the early 1800s as a part of a land lottery that was, that land was made available, of course, after the federal government removed Native Americans from those lands and then opened them up to whites. And so our family came down from Virginia in the early 1800s, received a little 200 acre parcel of land and kind of
That's
set
not
up
so little 200 acres.
Yeah, it's not tiny. It's not quite Gone with the Wind
Right.
plantation, but it's But yeah, no, it's a sizable piece of land that really kind of was our beginning. So with that history, and as I said, growing, and I also grew up Southern Baptist, mostly in Jackson, Mississippi, where I lived most of my life. It was really a personal book, and so trying to kind of come to terms with, what do we see in the public opinion data about where Americans are, and particularly where white Christians are on attitudes of race and systemic racism, and how do we connect up where the country is in public opinion data with this legacy, this history
Yeah.
that we've had in the country. So the book was really about just wrestling with putting my personal story, history, and current public opinion data kind of all together.
Yeah, it's kind of a meld of both the biographical stuff as well as kind of the quantitative work you've done, is
Yeah.
what I gather.
Yeah, I should say too, it's the first time I've ever written anything in the first person. Usually I have my social scientist hat on and I'm trying to describe kind of the landscape from 30,000 feet. But this one, there was just no way I could write this without making it personal. So, the first sentence in the book has the word I in it. The last sentence in the book has the word us in it. So I'm writing as someone very much enmeshed, in this story. And the book, in many ways, it really is my own personal journey, and try to tell it that way of reckoning myself with this really complicated history.
Yeah, I really want to talk about that part, but also, I mean, your undergrad was like in mathematics, right? Well,
Right.
and I guess what I'd like to know, since you went to seminary, got a master's
Yeah.
and the MDiv, right? It seems like you were on the ministerial track, but now you're kind of the head of a policy institute. How did that happen?
Yeah. So, it's one of those things where I can look back and tell you a fictional story about a grand master plan I had to kind of go this route. But like most people's journeys, they're a little windy. So yeah, I was a computer science and math major growing in as an undergrad at Mississippi College. Now I was at a Baptist college, which meant that I took some religion classes,
Yeah.
and religion was sort of everywhere in the environment. And I felt a call to ministry toward the end of my time as an undergrad, and so finished up my degree in math and computer science, but then went to seminary and did an MDiv at Southwestern Seminary there, and then along the way really realized that calling was really more of an academic trajectory, and that's really the direction I felt like I should go. So then went from there to do the PhD at Emory. So that was kind of the path. But along the way, I mean, this kind of intersection of religion and politics has always been something that's fascinated me. And I kind of realized in my academic work that there was a way of kind of bringing in, my quantitative interest in statistics and math, that you could actually describe religious phenomena in the country, either demographics or public opinion, using those tools. So that's kind of how I finally merged those streams. It took me a while to kind of merge those streams, but by the time I was my first teaching gig at Missouri State, and then came to DC to kind of work more in the think tank world, those two things actually were really helpful to have together.
Yeah. Well, can I ask, because one of the things as a social scientist too, I'm interested in how you came to develop a critical lens, particularly so because we're just submerged in dominant culture as white men,
Yep.
particularly, especially those of us in the South, and those of us who do develop that lens are kind of an anomaly, outliers in quantitative or statistical terms, right? So if you were to kind of go back and I know this is retrospective, right, but were there pivotal moments that like caused fractures in your racial understanding? Because there were for me, and I'm just wondering, when I get to talk with other white folks, white men in particular, were there things that happened that caused you to question that might not have caused other white folks to raise critical questions about race and whiteness?
Yeah. Well, I credit my parents here, who were not by any means political. I mean, they were not like political activists or organizers or anything like that. But the one, I think, thing they did that from a very early age gave me enough, just some critical distance, was I knew that they had a very strong conversation with their parents and the older generation, older than them, that when we came to visit, because we had moved away, so when we came from Mississippi to visit, that they were not to use the N word, they were not to talk about African Americans in a derogatory way. And when that rule got broken, I was aware that that my mom, like on one occasion I can remember, was like really angry, right, with her parents about that, about kind of letting that through to us. And so I knew from the beginning that my mom and my dad were trying to set a filter for us, right, that kind of didn't hand down all those same tropes and language, and all that didn't come down to us. They were kind of shielding us, I think, from that, and I was aware of that. It wasn't invisible. So I think that was one thing. The other thing is that in my so I was born in Atlanta, but I spent from age like 2 to 6 in the panhandle of Texas and in San Antonio, Texas, just for a couple of years before we landed in Jackson by the time I was 7. But in that time, especially in San Antonio, I went to first grade in San Antonio, and the weird thing I remember that also was just another one of those little kind of aha moments, was hearing racial slurs and even racial jokes aimed at Latinos, right, in San Antonio. And I realized that it was a lot of the same jokes and tropes that I had heard used about African Americans in the South, all of a sudden being used. And there was something about that said, oh, okay, there's something false here, right? That you could kind of take the same kind of prejudices, apply them to a different people group. That it's just about othering, right? That's the way I didn't have that language, of course, at age 6, but there was just something in my head that kind of went, oh, this is weird that I'm hearing the same kinds of things. And I think just the kind of presence of my parents. My mom taught in public schools, in Jackson, even as they were being integrated. And in fact, later in my life, she taught in the Greenville, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta public schools were just overwhelmingly African American. Working with kids who are having trouble reading in first grade. So I think seeing them live out their lives in kind of quiet ways, both overt and quiet ways, I think were some give me critical distance. And I guess the last thing I'll say here, as a little bit of a long-winded answer, I'm realizing, but the last thing I'll say is reading. That I got exposed even at Southwestern. I had a professor, Jeff Poole, who was a systematic theology professor who had trained at the University of Chicago, and he handed us Gustavo Gutierrez, historian, right, who's writing a history not just from the perspective of a white guy. And we were reading, we read King, we read Howard Thurman, we read, so it was kind of opening us up to different perspectives other than just the Baptist or the kind of white Christian. It wasn't just the neighbors that we were reading in that class. And I think that too was like, oh, okay, there's a whole other world out here that I don't really know, that was intriguing to me. But it took, people outside of me kind of helping, just open that door a little bit along the way.
Well, I think seeing your parents challenge their parents too and model, not only kind of make you aware that something's wrong with this language, it's degrading, right? But then also, because my sister did that with my parents, when she would come home, she was really the first to challenge them. I was like, good for you. So did you read Cone at that point, or did you get exposed to liberation theology too, or?
Yeah, a little bit. It was a little bit of liberation theology, but it was really at Emory that I got more of a full, kind of dose of Cone and more Thurman and others there. But I have to say, so I mean, this is, I think, testimony to kind of where we are, is that the person I never read until really the last 5 years was James Baldwin. Had virtually no exposure to him through kind of my educational, and after, it's kind of crazy. I mean, 4 years in seminary, 6 years in a PhD program, never once got assigned James Baldwin to read.
Yeah, I got a master's in philosophy and never read anything Eastern. How can that happen? I mean, well, did you dive off? I mean, at what point did you, because you just, quoted or cited the fact that you have this ancestor 6 generations back that was part of a land lottery. And the town I'm in was founded on a land lottery. Basically, the Creek folks were exterminated and reservated and, removed, and then they literally had a lottery. It's like you said in other interviews I've seen, where they chopped it up into square pieces and white men were able to pull their names. But when did you dive off into the personal family history? Has that been since you were at the PRRI, or was it a part of before that?
It's kind of been along the way. Like I was aware of, so when I was at seminary in my 20s, actually, my mother gave me our family Bible from 1815 that had been passed down on her side of the
Wow.
family, all the way, for 200 years.
Wow.
And so, and it's like many of these old Bibles, in between the Old and New Testaments, it has these family
Right.
marriages, birth, deaths, right,
Yeah,
stuff where you
sometimes they have
kind
a
of
tree, right, too.
yeah. So, and it had handwritten stuff, and when that got filled up, it had pages
Yeah.
inserted, in the middle. So that actually got me interested in it. And then we also knew that, there was one piece of that land. I mean, what happens, these things over time, they get chopped up
Right.
from relative to relative over time. But there was one piece of that original plot of land that was still in my mother's family's possession. It was down to a few acres, so it wasn't a big plot at all, but it did include the family cemetery.
Uh,
That had those ancestors that I had the names in the Bible
wow.
that were there. That kind of first and second generation of folks, were there, and so that I think brought it pretty. You could see the headstones, you could see the writing, that kind of
Right.
iron oxidized brown ink in the in those pages. I think it brought it, having that artifact, seeing that that I'd seen those things, that cemetery growing up, brought it pretty close. And I was standing on the land, right,
Yeah.
in that cemetery. It brought it pretty close to home.
Yeah, did you ever, because I'm fixing to have a conversation with another person here in the South about descendants of ours who own enslaved folks, right? And I think this is part of a bigger question, I guess, because um, and I want to get into kind of the policy stuff later, but if it's okay, it seems to me a lot of us don't want to go dig because of what we're afraid we might find out, and then
Yeah,
it makes it very real, whether that's ancestors during colonization, or whether it's ancestors that participated in lynching, or at least were complicit and silent, or folks who owned people. Um, I mean, is that a fair assessment of kind of white resistance to American history, be it personal or on the national level? Because we are kind of in this backlash now with the 1776 project, right? That it seems to me that the part of the culture war is: are we going to tell the truth? Or are we going to
yeah.
go back to a mythology? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's fair to say that white Christians in the South have since the Civil War been involved in a mythologizing of the South. And so there's been I mean, that's really what all the Confederate monument
Right.
erections are about. I mean, they're about a kind of valorization, of the Confederate way of life in the South. And many of those monuments have, in Latin, God will vindicate, right?
Right.
The motto of the Confederacy still on them, right? Even after they're long, even though they were built in 1920,
Right.
they've got that motto on them. So I think this is not new, right? That one of the things we've got to do, I think, is to uh, disavow, right, these false histories that we've been telling, that really sweep the violence under the rug, that sweep our responsibility for the violence under the rug. But I think it is what makes it a little bit hard. It's much easier to tell a sort of romanticized story about our Confederate and Revolutionary War ancestors, right, as if they were all doing the same thing and all fighting on the side of liberty, even when clearly, and I say this, I mean, I have, in fact, I mentioned the Bible. The Bible was originally owned by one of my ancestors named Pleasant Moon. It's a weird name. It's a British name, actually. And he and his uncles both were, well, his father fought in the Civil War, and it's just right there. His father and his uncle both fought in the Civil War. Both were slave owners, and enslaved people in Middle Georgia. So yeah, it's one of the hardest things that I found. I mean, through the kind of miracle that online genealogy research is today, is the actual handwritten estate settlement from, who would have been my sixth great uncle, Pleasant Moon Sr., for whom my direct ancestor is named. And on there he lists his property. I put this in the book because it was so kind of moving to me to see on handwritten, on this document, where he lists everything he owned, like a chair, or 6 chairs, 1 table, one
Right.
one bay mare, 1 wagon. And in the midst of all this are 4 human beings, right?
Right.
Just listed in the inventory. And what struck me was that the human beings accounted for about, actually a little more than 2/3 of their
Wealth.
earthly assets, right? They were the most expensive investments that they had. And it was, and this was a kind of, I would probably put them in the lower middle class farmer today. I mean, in today's dollars, their entire assets were $50,000 in today's dollars. So not a wealthy,
Right.
family at all. And yet 2/3 of that 50,000 was invested in enslaving other human beings. So to see that on the page and to see them by name, right? Naomi, Bird, like, they're named, and then a
Right.
dollar amount put right next to these human beings with names is shocking, and it's disturbing. So I think, it's you know it's tough, I think, if that's what might be there. But I think if we're gonna move into a place of healing, I think this is the thing for me. Like, this is not about guilt; it's about healing,
Yeah.
for me, right? That
Yeah.
we got to come to terms with this if we're really going to live into a fuller, healthier future together.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's where folks are misguided. When my struggle with white liberals in terms of racial justice is I think a lot of people frame it, and conservatives too, as I'm going to have to give something up, that I'm going to lose something, versus frame it and in terms of what we have to gain. And I think the gain, because I think what we think we're going to lose in terms of privilege or status is still defined by dominant culture, capitalism, and a few other things. And in the process, really kind of denies our mutual humanity. But I was just wondering because, it'll be interesting. And I think the other thing that people are concerned about, if we tell the truth, is the discussion of reparations, right? Do we have that or not? Particularly if we're personally implicated or, through our descendants are somehow personally implicated in some ways. But there was something else historical that I didn't know until you talked about it as a Southern Baptist. I mean, can you just talk a little bit about kind of white supremacy and Christianity? Because as I understand it, you did a lot of work, particularly leading up to the last election, right? And analysis on Christians, how they voted in the 2016 election. And if I'm not mistaken, you found pretty much across the board that Christians, regardless of stripe, were big Trump supporters, and it gets painted as kind of evangelical only. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable that if you want to describe the American electorate in religious terms, the easiest way to, or kind of with a big broad brush and not be too inaccurate, you can basically say that white Christians of all kinds voted majority for Trump in the last 2 elections. And it should also be said, there was virtually no movement in
Right.
white Christian support for Trump between 2016 and 2020. So just straight across the board, very, very consistent. Now, the levels look a little different. So white evangelicals are a lot more all in. So they're about 8 and 10 who supported President Trump. But if you look at what is often cast as the more liberal or progressive end of the white Protestant world, the mainline Protestant churches, right? The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, 6 and 10 of that group supported Trump. And if you look at also
Can
white
we
Catholics,
pause there for just a second? Because one of the important things about those denominations is their education level, right? At one point, Episcopalians were, in terms of educational attainment, were some of the highest in the country.
No, that's right. I mean, that's still largely true. You can still see educational differences between mainline and evangelical. It has been closing a bit, but it's still higher there. So that's right. So higher education didn't necessarily predict among white Christians, dramatically lower support for Trump, and then white Catholics, who are interesting because they had their own history of being persecuted in this
Absolutely.
country,
Yeah.
and still about 6 in 10 white Catholics supported Trump, and again, basically no drop off
Right.
from 2016.
Well, that's really important given the discussion of white nationalism January the 6th, because most folks I know, I think, have reduced Trump support down to a radical fringe.
Yeah.
In fact, it really wasn't, right?
No, and even when we've done one national poll even after January 6th, and what we found is that Trump's favorability dropped a bit, but not that much.
Right.
It certainly didn't go below majority support for those groups. They're all still majority supporting Trump. We had a question about whether you agree or disagree with the whole range of statements. One of the statements was Trump is a true patriot. And we had 80% of white evangelicals still saying yes to that statement, even after January 6th. So a little bit of drop off in favorability, but not anything that looks anywhere near like abandonment or
Right.
rejection or
Shift in
anything like that.
consciousness.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I know you're doing quantitative work and not qualitative, but because one of the things I've been trying to talk with conservatives about, conservative evangelicals in particular, is how do you make sense out of Trump, given your espoused faith tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did y'all tap into the rationale behind why there wasn't a shift or what the justification was? Because most of us that come out of those faith traditions see Trump as a contradiction to many things that are core to the teachings of Christ, for example.
Yeah.
Did y'all look at that or have an
Yeah.
opportunity?
Well, here's my best take on that. Look, there's no doubt that evangelicals who, branded themselves as values voters, right, in the 2004 elections, and particularly with their support for George W. Bush, and proclaimed that they were going to sort of vote according to their Christian values and evaluate candidates according to their Christian values. One of the people who's been the most dismayed about this is actually Russell Moore at the Southern Baptist Convention, who has said, like, look, this is what we said. This is how we said we'd be voting, and came out strongly and said there's no way you can justify on these principles support for Trump.
Right.
Now he was very much turned out to be a minority voice in this even in the Southern Baptist world, and in fact had to apologize after the 2016 election, essentially to keep his job.
Right.
That's been very troubling. But
And he was one of the few voices that raised it, right?
Yep. No, that's right. Yep. But what ended up happening is that I think that it's very safe to say that white evangelicals have utterly abandoned this idea of being values voters, right, and voting along those lines. And instead, what they've done, you'll appreciate my philosophy 101 here. I think they have. They've really gone from, if you're in a philosophy class, you kind of learn about different approaches to ethics and political ethics. And so one of them is an ethics of principle, right? A kind of deontological approach where here are my principles. I'm going to apply them across the board. I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. That's really what a values voter should be doing, right? I think they've just shifted to a wholesale consequentialist ethic here, right? That they've given up on evaluating things according to principles and values, and they've just decided we have this end in mind, and the means really cease to matter, right? So Trump is a means to an end,
right?
And in fact, when you listen to somebody like Reverend Paul Jeffers, who's the pastor of First Baptist Dallas, one of the earliest Trump supporters, I mean, when they asked him, he was in a national NPR interview. Actually, he was actually debating Russell Moore in this interview, and they asked him this question: how can you possibly support this guy? And he just said, look, when I look at what a mess the world is in and all the directions our country is changing that I don't like, and that is anathema to Christians, I want the meanest son of a what I can find in the Oval Office, and that's Donald Trump. And that was his straightforward justification. So I've kind of argued that they've really moved from being values voters to, if you want to kindly call it, nostalgia voters. I think that's maybe the nicest way of putting it. And that Make America Great Again slogan, that again word at the end, is really the one that has all the power.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of rewinding the clock back to a kind of 1950s America where white Christians were in the demographic majority, they were in the cultural majority. And, you know, and I think the kind of big scare, you know, the country has moved from being a majority Christian country to one that's no longer, or sorry, majority white Christian country, the one's no longer a majority white Christian country. Just since 2008, we had our first African American in the White House who got elected not once but twice.
Right.
So it wasn't a fluke, right? It
Right.
happened twice. And during that period, the country also shifted dramatically into supporting like same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights, right? So if you were a white Christian who was fed that, you know, the basis of your worldview is that we are America, right? Like this country is for us, and it's kind of divinely ordained to be ours.
Right.
There's a kind of hierarchy of white over black, and this vision of a you know, family that is headed by a male, married to a female,
Right.
in a kind of hierarchical, and all that's a kind of black and white hierarchical worldview. The world is literally upside down, right? From where the country has moved to. And I think that that's really what's behind, I think, the visceral reactions here.
Yeah, Durkheim talks about his enemy, right? Like a feeling of normlessness, or norms have been turned upside down and nothing makes sense anymore. Because we are talking about a lot of social change in the course of decades. And I think I heard you say this one time, it's another thing we had in common. I mean, we're old enough, or at least I am, I won't speak for you, to remember desegregation, right? It was in 54, but the schools here, it was in the 70s.
That's right.
Right. So, you know, we're talking massive social change in some ways that has certainly upset that apple cart of the normal hierarchy, right? Now, I'd also throw in there kind of income and wealth inequality, right? In America, you know, I don't think the major religion's Christianity. I think it's really capitalism. Like because you can't say that I'm not making it because of capitalism and how capitalism works. It's the immigrants that are taking my jobs, or women not being women anymore. You know what I mean? We have to take other kind of folks. But I want to come back to the Southern Baptists because one of the things you found out in your research is that it's really the formation of Southern Baptist over the question of slavery, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is another, I think, testimony to how much work has been done to render our history invisible. That I grew up, and you know, inside of Southern Baptist churches, and in fact, in one Southern Baptist church from the time I was 7 till the time I was 20. You know, and I was that kid. I was there all the time. I mean, I was there 5 days a week. I went to youth group. I
Vacation Bible school,
choir practice. I went to vacation Bible school. Yeah. I mean, if it was open and you know, there, I was there. You know, if I wasn't out of town or sick, I was at church. And you know, and I heard nothing about the origins of our denomination, even what the word Southern and Southern Baptist meant. I had no clue. I thought it just meant we're
here in the South.
right?
Me too.
Right,
yeah, exactly.
Right. You know, but I had no idea that word was put there. So you know, just very in a nutshell, it was 1845 is when the Southern Baptists broke off from the Northern. Well, they were all just Baptists, and then the Southern Baptists broke off and appended that word Southern ahead of there. And the breaking point was over. You mentioned missions. You know, the breaking point was over a candidate to the mission field who was a slave owner. And they intentionally, in fact, put this candidate forward as a test case. The Southern churches did, in order to precipitate a fight. And when the Northern churches said, no, we can't back this candidate because we don't think enslaving other people is compatible with the gospel, the Southern churches took that and broke off and formed their own convention in 1845. Attached the word Southern to it, which was really just a very thinly veiled synonym for slavery. I mean, they really should have named it the Slavery Supporting Baptist Convention. Is what the real name of the convention should have been. And the Methodists did the same thing in same year. So if you think about the power, the cultural power of that, right? That's before the Civil War. It's like 15 years before the Civil War. So
Right.
what we really get is that we get white Christians, Methodists and Baptists, who are the most numerous congregations across the South, who actually set the pattern and the format for political secession,
Right.
right?
Right.
They actually, there was religious secession before there
First,
was
yeah.
political secession. I had no idea that that was the history of our denomination, that we were literally formed to make enslaving other people on the basis of the color of their skin compatible with the gospel.
Yeah, and you're like you said, it's less than 2 decades before we go, or actually decade and a half before we go to war with
Yeah.
ourselves, right? It's, I think,
And the same
1850.
players.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah,
same players, right? So the people who are leading the secessionist movement in Baptist circles are also the people leading the secessionist movement in Alabama,
yeah,
right, and in Mississippi. So they're it's not like there's like overlapping circles of who these people
yeah.
are. Like they're moving from religious to political actors.
When you said, when did you find all that out? Like at what point?
I didn't get a clear picture of that till I was in seminary, and I was sitting in a Baptist history class, and I was also, by the way, reading the first Baptist history textbook written by a white Baptist theologian that told the truth
Yeah,
about that. And that book was published in like 1984.
right, right.
So,
When that's
yeah,
not accidental. I mean, again, I think about the power to tell the story and who records history. And you mentioned
yeah,
monuments earlier. I mean, the Confederate monuments were really a propaganda campaign, if we think about it in those terms. But a lot of us don't find out until later in life, especially if we get to go to college or get to go to graduate school where those conversations happen. It's utterly amazing, which kind of relates. I mean, so we had all that little moment in time, right, from about 1840 to 1865, and then Reconstruction. I mean, I'm sure you follow Reverend Barber's stuff, right? He
yeah.
he argues we're just in the third Reconstruction, and it certainly feels that way, especially in the last week here in Georgia. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the 5 dozen voting bills that are,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that we're doing the same thing we did during Reconstruction, trying to disempower Black votes, right? I mean, is that a
Yeah.
fair critique?
Well, again, I just think of the history I was never taught, that I was taught. So, when I went all the way up through public schools in Jackson, Mississippi, in the Jackson Public School District, I was taught zero about Reconstruction. I could not even have told you that term by the time I graduated high school. It wasn't until much, much later that I got any sense of that, nor did I know that, when you mention like civil rights or the Civil Rights Act, everybody thinks about 1965. Uh, but there was a whole set of
Right.
civil rights acts that were passed right after the Civil War, right? They very quickly got overturned. Um, but like I was totally ignorant of that history too. That in 1965 we were repeating something that had already happened 100 years ago, had been overturned, and then there was this, 100 years of whites kind of clawing their way back to power and disenfranchising African Americans. I mean, that there's no way to read the history of 1870 to 1965 without just saying basically the political history of the country is whites, particularly in the South, trying to just claw their way back to power after defeat in the Civil War.
Yeah, and doing that sometimes in collusion with whites in the North, right?
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I mean, I
No,
think
I
that,
mean
yeah, when what's your kind of
every city.
yeah, what you're kind of outlining is how white supremacy was maintained, right? That the two of us could go on to higher ed and spend way too much time in college, and it's only later in our educational careers that the question of the supremacy of whites, right? That wasn't, for me,
Yeah.
that wasn't omitted accidentally, right? Because you
No.
telling the
Right.
truth challenges white supremacy, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Because I think about this example. So I was born in '68. I don't know. That probably puts me
60,
pretty close to your
63.
age.
Yeah, I've got 5
Okay.
years on you.
So, but here's the thing. I remember. I mean, this is how I remember too. So, Brown v. Board of Education is 1954,
Yeah, right.
right? I'm born 14 years after Brown v. Board of
Yeah.
Education, and yet I remember when the first African American kids
Okay.
showed up in our public schools,
Third grade.
right? So Mississippi drug its heels until the mid 70s, right? Actually integrating our schools.
When and they had to be probably forced by the feds. They
Oh
they
yeah,
withdrew federal funds here. It wasn't like white
right,
people had an epiphany and go, this is unchristian. It was only until
right.
the federal dollars were pulled from our county school. And I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in
Yeah.
the 70s that folks kind of, I mean, is that what happened there?
Yeah, after like, all kind, years and years and years of like legal wrangling and
Right.
maneuvering and throwing up this excuse and that excuse. And finally, yeah, there was an ultimatum issued that said, you got 1 year, right, to
Exactly the
do
same
this,
thing.
or
Right, right.
that, or the funds are gone. And that's what finally, led people to do it. And then of course, the response was, the external response was the standing up of all of these segregation academies, private Christian academies,
Religious.
where all the
Yeah,
white kids could flee to, right?
yeah.
So they have to go to school of blacks. But here's the real criminal thing, I think, is that why didn't my church had nothing to say, absolutely nothing to say about why we were suddenly going to school with African American kids and why they were suddenly showing up at our schools. Like there was no attempt, not even a false story.
Yeah.
Like there was just utter silence on this thing that was changing our social worlds quite dramatically. And they gave us like no context for understanding how we were supposed to understand this moment from a Christian point of view. There was just nothing there. And I just think like what a moment it would have been, right, for the church to say, here's what's going on. Here's why we're going to spend the next 4 Sunday school lessons talking about what's going on in your life, right?
But
And there
then,
was
but
just
then the
none of
church
that.
has to, I mean, the church, if we dive off in that history, right, they got to maybe divulge how the denomination is founded, right? And
Yeah,
like,
yeah, we'd have to dig up the fact that we had a whites only policy
right.
for church attendance in our church. Like that was an official policy on the books. But to face those kinds of things.
Yeah. I don't know what about there, but it wasn't until 2012 that our city school system fully complied with desegregation with law. Like it was 2012,
Wow.
and they had
Yeah.
to be forced to do it then. Like, so
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we've both kind of bared witness this, and this kind of goes back to my initial question with you, because for me, one of the schisms that broke into all the racist stereotypes, because my family's pretty racist, they weren't liberal by any stretch of the imagination, was in 3rd grade. It was a fellow named Titus Coleman and Wendell Lewis. I remember them to this day. There were first two black young boys that I went to school with, and we became friends and played Little League. And they were really the people who dispelled every stereotype I had been told about. It really created this conflict internally that they're not anything like I've been told, right? And I grew up 3 blocks from public housing. So I had proximity to black folks, but they weren't in my lives until schools were desegregated, literally in like 72, 73 here.
Yep.
Well, and can we just talk about white supremacy? Because this
Yeah.
not knowing, right? And I think I think you've talked about this a lot, and I talk about it a lot. When I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about the Klan, the neo-Nazis, Boogaloo Boys, or whatever current manifestation we have, right? And I really appreciated the fact that you kind of switched the words around to talk about the supremacy of whites instead of white supremacy, because I think a lot of white people do think, well, I'm not a Klan member. But can you just say something about how you think about and see white supremacy?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing,
Because
we white.
It's distinct from racism in some
Yeah. I
ways,
think
right?
it's distinct from slavery. It's distinct
Right.
from segregation. I mean, I'll start by saying, that I think the main thing we have to do, we white people, I think, and particularly we white Christians, is to disabuse ourselves that the word white supremacy is a faded black and white photograph of the Klan burning a cross, right? That's not really white supremacy. I mean, it is white supremacy, an extreme form of it, but I did in the book, I kind of play around with what happens if we just flip the words around, right, to say, the supremacy of whites. What does that really mean? It really means, right, that as something I said earlier, it really becomes about ownership of our communities in our country, right? That this the idea that this is a white Christian country. This is a country for whites and for white Christians. And I mean, and that's pretty deep. Like even a liberal, or what people I think often think of as a liberal president like FDR, said, this is a white Christian, he actually said it's a white Protestant country,
Absolutely.
right? And everybody else is here by sufferance. And so that was a pretty widespread belief And I think it is at the core of that, this sense that white lives are worth more than others, that whites deserve more than others, and that this is somehow the way the world is and the way that God designed the world to be, right? This is a pretty deeply held belief, and it got expressed, not just in, like I said, in these kind of extreme acts of racial violence, but it got expressed in our zoning laws,
Yeah.
right? So if you just look at every city, every major city, even small towns in the country, were often, like, and not just in the South, Chicago, Detroit, New
Yeah.
York, were LA, were had whites only areas with and they were, first of all, by law, then they came to be by kind of zoning policy, and then by local private neighborhood covenants.
Right.
So when one version of this got struck down, another one just kind of popped up in its place. But you could see that legacy in virtually every city in the country today, right? That there's still a section that's mostly white people, mostly African Americans, in some bigger cities, mostly Latino, but they have their history in this redlining practice of ensuring whites only neighborhoods, what kind of jobs you could get, what kind of loans you could get, even for your houses. Or like in my dad's case, he was, both my parents were the first ones to go to college in our family, and my dad went on a GI Bill, and after serving in Vietnam. And many African Americans couldn't get access to those same benefits. That's how my dad gets to college and sets my siblings and I up to go to college, right? And so it's just so deeply built into, who could attend the community swimming pool, like, it's just all kinds of stuff that's like so concrete. It's not abstract at all. And this legacy is just so clearly still with us today. That's what I think we've got to reckon with this history of basically just unfairness, right? That we tilted the playing field in our favor, and pretended that it was because we were more important than anyone else.
Yeah, I think about it in all those ways, but also kind of as the standard we use to measure everybody else, right? Like white folks or Western civilization, which is kind of code. People of European descent, right, are the standard by which we'll measure all other human groups, right? And it's fascinating. I had a conversation with a liberal activist yesterday who's white, and I was trying to explain white supremacy, and this person's tried to do kind of racial justice work in the community, but he never, and it's well intended, right, but he never thought to reach out to all the folks of color and everybody else who'd been doing that work. He just kind of went off and started his own thing. And I explained to him, or we're trying to talk about, well, why didn't any of those folks who've done what you've already done, why weren't they worth talking to? Like, and what does it mean that you assume that maybe you were doing something new, which might have been tried for decades? It's real interesting how, I see myself manifested at times, right? Kind of I know better, or and I think the other, before, it seems to me, and just tell me, because you've been doing this too, before, at least in my experience, when I've tried to talk with white folks about white supremacy, there's almost a preceding conversation about, do you know you're white? Like, and owning the fact that we are a member of a racial group, right? Versus being individuals. And not only that, there's a great article I used to use when I taught about how just the engaging somebody about being white will often get framed as reverse racism, because you're not letting the white person be raceless, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? So it's like before we can talk about white supremacy, do you know you're white? Have you ever thought about it? Why not? Do you know you're part of this racial group, whether you want to be or not, right? And it's not anything you did that's bad. It's just how it was all set up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, all the old language of like colored people, right? It has it in there, like, so we don't have color, but everybody else does. Like, it kind of is that whiteness as the invisible standard, and then everything else gets compared to it. And then I think the other thing we don't realize is that white is to kind of recognize whiteness as a malleable category, right? That if you were Irish, if you were Jewish, if you were Italian, 100 years ago, those people were not admitted into
Absolutely.
the category of whiteness,
Well,
right?
and some were even, I mean, I think the Irish are considered black at one point from a
Yeah,
legally, we're talking the legal construction of race, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that it's been a kind of malleable category. And what it's really stood for is power,
Yeah.
right? It's really just stood for access to the highest levels of opportunity
Yeah.
in the country. And that's what you get if you get admitted into the category, into the
Right.
club
Right.
of whiteness, right? Is
Right.
that you get access to all the best stuff.
Yeah.
You get a leg up, is what
Yeah.
it really amounts to.
Well, and I think what's cool about some anti-racism work is it's raised the question of what does it mean to have to give up ethnicity for racial status? Like when, Irish folks or Italian folks or Sicilian or Greek folks lose their language, really assimilate into kind of
Hmm.
WASP dominant culture. Like, is there an existential cost for that? Like what, I get the political benefits of whiteness, right? But what about culture and what has to be discarded in that process? Seems important too. You said something else in a talk I listened to that I really appreciated, because for years I've been harping on the fact that we really haven't had reconciliation processes in the United States in comparison to other places. And mind you, they're imperfect, right? Whether it's South Africa or Australia or Germany, right? But what we seem to have is consolation as a poor substitute for reconciliation. So, you know what I mean? Like movements force change, and it's almost like the dominant group, white folks go, Jesus Christ, well, let them in the schools, like, and those who have means will start the private school, right? Or
Yeah.
we'll let folks vote, and right? Let is the operative word. And so you said something in a talk where, the distinction between reconciliation and justice, or the relationship between those two things. And I mean, do you think that's a fair critique? Like, because it seems like if it's consolation, white supremacy stays intact, right? Which is dehumanizing, in my opinion, to white folks in its own way, right? And what does reconciliation look like? Are we capable? Is a society founded on genocide, colonization, 246 years of chattel slavery, then decades of neo-slavery with debt peonage, decades of lynching, decades of Jim Crow, not to mention not letting white women vote, not to mention, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what does reconciliation look like if we really come to terms with who we are as a nation? And I don't know what I'm asking you here. I guess it seems to me we just have these band-aid approaches which let the pressure valve off, right? But then white supremacy reinstates itself. It's happening right now in Georgia at our state house with voter suppression laws, right? Just like it did with Reconstruction when black folks got a little political power. Oh, hell no, right? And we're gonna do it legally, right? We're going to legislate basically the reinstallment of white dominance.
Yeah, I've become pretty wary of white people using the word reconciliation. And I write about this a little bit, and I think it's because of what I've learned by watching a number of different efforts across the country. The easiest thing in the world for white people to reach for, if they're going to do any of this work at all, is to reach directly for reconciliation and to say, look, let's just put our arms around each other. We're going to sing Kumbaya, and we're going to kind of march off into the sunset together. But I think to put that into, like, maybe in theological terms, we would call that cheap grace growing up, that because it doesn't account for any real sense of repentance. It doesn't really count for any real work of repair. And those are really the two words that I think white Christians really ought to be focusing on, is repentance and repair. And I think for two reasons. One is, I mean, if there's anything you get very clear, and I'll just speak theologically for a moment here, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is the sense that, authentic worship can only come if there's been work to do justice between human beings, right? That both the Old Testament, New Testament, that there are words put in the mouth of God saying, like, don't come to the altar if there's something wrong between you and your brother or your sister. Go make that right first,
Right.
then you can come. And I think we ought to take that really to heart. And it doesn't, and that work is not really reconciliation. That I think reconciliation, I think, is always the product of something else, right? You can't really produce it, right? What produces
Right.
it is work for justice and repair,
It's
right?
the, it's
And
the
part of it,
result. It's a result of that.
yeah, it's a result of this other work, right? And so I mean, and this is Scott Dickinson in Macon, really was, I think, super clarifying. And he said, look, we just stopped using, he said, they stopped using the word, that this white church that's in partnership with an African American church, we've stopped using the word reconciliation. We're going to talk about repair and justice. And what's going to happen, I think, is that if white folks did, and white Christians did enough work of repair and justice, our African American brothers and sisters are going to tell us when we're reconciled, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it will work. We'll know, right? Because
Yeah.
it'll manifest itself in changed relationships
Right.
at the end of the day. And I want to reiterate this point too, that the repair and justice work, that it does involve telling the truth. If you said, I've kind of boiled it down sometimes to say, look, repair and justice really does come down to two really basic Christian principles: telling the truth and loving our neighbors. Right? If we really commit to telling the truth and loving our neighbors, including our African American neighbors, it would be revolutionary, for the church. And again, it's not just, certainly part of that work of repair is to repair damaged relationships between us and African Americans, but the other piece of that repair is to repair the damage we've done to ourselves, right, for swallowing this lie and to integrating this lie that white lives are worth more than others into our theology and our churches. Like that's a very distorting way of living in the world, and it distorts even our, I think, I would assert it distorts our ability to be in right relationship with God. So if we're concerned about our own personal relationships with God, which there's nothing that Southern Baptists obsess over more than that,
Right.
then we really have to take this work not just as something altruistic that we're doing for others, but actually we have a deep, deep self-interest
Yeah.
for ourselves and our kids,
Yeah.
right, to fix this.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was kind of alluding to before when I talked about my dissertation research was on white anti-racist initiatives, and I looked at 15, I was in 15 cities in 7 states. It was largely qualitative, but I found that there were at least 2 camps I was interested in motivating factors. And a lot of folks, particularly Christian anti-racist initiatives in the Presbyterian Church of America and others, Unitarian, were very obligatory, right? That it was an obligation as a good Christian or faith or person of faith to live up to certain values. And then there was a whole cadre of folks that were doing it from a place of self-interest, that they recognized that it was both, that it wasn't dichotomous, that I'm going to gain something if we end oppression, of people of color, of women, whoever, that world's going to be better for me too. And I'm going to be more human in many ways, right? But it's hard to talk about that in kind of the dominant framework of value, again, if people perceive having to give something up. Because it seems to me, and I think you'd agree with this, is that the problem isn't privilege. The problem is everybody doesn't enjoy that privilege. I mean, I think we should live in a place where the police don't harass me, but they shouldn't harass you either. We should live in a place where I should enjoy not being sexually assaulted, but so should everybody else, including women and trans people or whoever else, right? So, and that's a hard conversation to have, and it kind of leads me into something else that I heard another talk, and I think about this a lot, where you cited kind of the murder of George Floyd, Charlottesville, and Dylan Roof. And I hate to ask this question, but it seems to me when I look back on American history, particularly movement stuff, that it's almost as if people have to be like sacrificed. There has to be blood before there's a conversation or a national response, right? And we're both old enough to, I can remember kind of Watts definitely Rodney King. I remember Bill Clinton's One America race discussion initiative that most people can't remember. I participated in it, right? But we've both been kind of old enough to know that generally some event happens and race boils to the consciousness of the country again. Not that it's not in the consciousness of people of color every day, right? But then we lose interest. And I mean, what do you think about that? That it does seem like people have to pay with their lives before we have them. It's almost like we're ADHD as a nation before we'll talk about race again. And every time I've been around long enough to feel like this time is different than the last.
Mm.
Well, is it? You know, in some ways it is, in some ways it may not be. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at, what I hear from, my African American friends, just exhaustion, right?
yeah,
That here we are again. Are we gonna really have this conversation? Are we really gonna change anything? And I think you're right. I mean, we've continually just kicked this can down the road, right? There's like an eruption that'll happen, and then there'll be some responses, and then it kind of things just kind of slide back, to the status quo, like a little blip. I will say this though, I do think that there are some signs that this moment may be one that has more traction than that. I'm not saying it's going to fix everything,
yeah,
but just a couple of things that are symbolic, but I think maybe point here. One is, my home state of Mississippi, in January, for the first time, raised a new flag above
yeah,
the Mississippi State Capitol that did not include the Confederate battle flag for the first time since 1894.
yeah.
I think that's a big deal. It's also a big deal because the Mississippi Baptist Convention backed the change,
Hmm.
which is something even 20 years ago they refused to do when it was on the ballot.
Right. I
Um, you know,
remember. We were
so
96. It was 1996 in
yeah,
Georgia.
right. So they finally spoke up in 2021. The other thing is I spent about 3 weeks in Richmond doing research of the book among these massive Confederate monuments down Monument Avenue in Richmond. They've got like it's like a 4 to 5 mile linear avenue with these big traffic circles
Right.
and punctuated by these gigantic 5 Confederate monuments. And they've been there. They weren't built during the Civil War. They were built between 1890 and 1920. Right, as kind of part of this, what you said, like kind of propaganda campaign, valorizing the lost cause of the Confederacy. And what's remarkable about that is that 4 of the 5 of the statues that are at the center of those have been removed,
Yeah.
just in the period of one summer, right? And the 5th one that got tied up into some court wrangling because it was unclear whether the state or the city had the authority to remove it.
Right.
But what happened is the Robert E. Lee memorial there was still standing. And what happened is the courts didn't remove it, but performance artists took it over, right? And they spray painted the pedestal with all these Black Lives Matter slogans. They projected an image of George Floyd onto the pedestal and BLM across
Right.
Robert E. Lee's horse. And that made the front cover of National Geographic magazine in January, right? Because it became this international
Yeah.
sign of racial justice protest. So I think there is a kind of moment of reckoning and transformation that's happening. And one thing that is different, I think, is that, and this is where I think it goes to our generation being the one to really finally do this work. We're at a place where the country has changed enough, right?
Absolutely.
We're no longer a majority white Christian country, as we talked about, and I think we're at a moment where we really might see the change that has been kind of held up for so many decades. And so, those two things I think are signs of some change. And just one more quick example: that one of those monuments, the Stonewall Jackson Monument, is ringed by some churches. One of them is First Baptist Church in Richmond, and that church rang their bell in celebration of the removal of that monument.
Nice.
And that was the same bell. They've had that bell since before the Civil War. And that church during the Civil War offered that bell to the Confederacy to be melted down for cannon to defend slavery. And in 2021, that bell got rung for racial justice. So I think, these are symbolic things, but I'm a little hopeful that we're going to
Yeah,
get
I don't want to come off as pessimistic.
yeah,
I say that in respect for the power of the ideology of white supremacy,
yeah,
right? And I say that in respect for the ideology of capitalism and militarism. I mean, I'm a Kingian at heart. I don't know about you, I want a radical revolution of values that he talked about in 67, right? And I think you're right. And I'm sure your institute talks about this. I mean, the demographics are changing. There's no stop to that, right? And I think the political backlash, especially in the last election, right? And I think Trump was a symptom, right? And he brought to the surface what was
yeah.
there, right? He just made it visible. In fact, when he was elected, I almost wrote a thank you letter to him for pulling the curtain back on what
Mm-hmm.
was really always here. So it does seem, and I heard you use this phrase at one point, that we kind of are at this moment again in our history. We've been here before in different ways, but the demographics are different. And as someone who's advocated for the removal of Confederate statues for a while, we penned an open letter to the governor way back, just not only removal of statues, but not use the tax revenue of Black Georgians to celebrate white supremacists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're still fighting that fight. And at the same time, a lot of the statues, it seems to me, came down as a consolation to people being in the streets and burning down stuff. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, um, and that's not all that happened, but I felt like it sometimes, and I want to see them down too. I don't necessarily want them teared down. If the UDC and the Confederate folks want them on their private property, they can do that. They're really their statues in my mind. But I also fear at times that was just one more consolation, right? Well, we took the statues down, and it again was
Yeah.
really, it was really the result of people taking to the streets, right? And putting their lives on the line, and property damage and all this other stuff. And at the same time, I want to acknowledge, right, that the fact that the president of the United States, as somebody who's done critical race studies, taught it, has made a film about whiteness, when he starts, basically banning critical race theory, that's a sign, right, to
Yeah.
me, that oh, okay, we must be getting at something. And not only that, as is all the backlash, right, among conservative pundits, we can expect that white folks are going to say that this is reverse racism, and any critical analysis is cancel culture. And so I agree with you, and I don't want to come off as cynical or anything, but you said this, like, to me, and I think it's one of the things we agree on. White supremacy is in the DNA of the country, right? And transforming, right, the country to be what it says it was, which was really never intended. It was really to me, a private club reserved for the aristocracy, who set it up on the backs and on the bones of the people who were here, right? It is an amazing human experiment, and that's the thing I love about the country. And it seems like we're in the midst of that struggle. We're always in the midst of it, but it is, I think conservative folks and folks who want to make sure it's make America great again, is really code for make America white again, right? Where we're at the top of that hierarchy, and we'll include some folks that we can point to and say, see, we've got so-and-so, we're not racist, but the power arrangement could stay the same. And I think the last thing that scares me is that we also have plenty of international examples of, even when white people were outnumbered numerically, they were able to control. I mean, India would be a great example, right? Millions upon millions of people. And it seems to me the GOP is trying to figure that out now, right? Of how do we maintain control as this country shifts? We'll do it and it seems that just like in 1860, folks are democratic as long as things go their way. And if they're not, there's all these unfounded accusations of voter fraud, right, that the data just doesn't bear out, and never has. Voter apathy has really been the problem in our country, more than any kind of systematic voter fraud. But yeah, you also talked about kind of white Christian theology, and I thought it would be useful to just explore that a little bit. And I mean, other people that bother to listen to these things. Like I was always tripping on the fact that Jesus was a white guy. I mean, it's a Middle Eastern religion. Like, and my
Right.
students over the years who would say racism's not a problem, especially when I taught in the South, I'd say, well, if racism is a problem, here's a way you can get some extra credit. Like, and I'll give you some big points if you do this. So if you're a believer, you go to church. Yeah, I'm a believer. I go to church. I was like, well, go to church and take a picture of a black Jesus and take that white Jesus down and put the black Jesus up and write a paper about it. And immediately folks are like, oh, hell no. Like there is this consciousness in us that is just below the surface. If prodded a little bit, will come up and go, oh yeah. And then we can have a conversation of why not only do white churches have that white Jesus, but why do some churches of color have the white Jesus? Right. I mean, what could be more emblematic of kind of white supremacy than making God white?
Yeah, and if you're a biblical inerrantist, it's even more kind of crazy making that you would have a white Jesus. But I think it's been important. I mean, I think we should, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you here, but if we don't dismiss it as absurd, right, and just it is absurd, right,
it can be both.
From a biblical standpoint, it's absolutely absurd. If you read the text more literally, but yeah, the kind of, so why is that so important? We really and take that question seriously. I think it's quite telling, that even the language we use, right? Let's let Jesus come into our heart, softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, these hymns, the language, it depends on if you put an African-American Jesus into that frame, for most white people, that language starts to be dissonant.
Yeah.
Right. And it might even be scary.
Yeah.
What would it mean to let a black man into your heart if you're white? Right. I mean, that would kind of freak many a white guy out. To think, and particularly if you add sex.
Yeah.
On top of that, right? And you think about what would it mean for a white teenage girl to let a black man into her heart, right? Not a problem for us, a white man, but it just shows you the work that race is doing. I think when you just flip it around and see that, or we just got, what would it mean for that nativity scene that sits out in front of the church, just a few months ago, have a brown Jesus in the manger, or we're about to be at Easter, that image of this suffering Son of God on the cross to be brown, right, as suffering for us. What would that do? I mean, it does real theological work, and I think doing that substitution, and that assignment you mentioned is exactly right. Like the resistance to that is the thing that tells you that whiteness is doing a lot of work.
Yeah, and we can start a conversation from that resistance point, that emotive response, right? Like, so we all do know, we're carrying this around with us all the time. And at times it can be brought to the surface with just one suggestion, right?
Yeah.
So I take it you're still a person of faith. And I'm just wondering, because I imagine by now you've read Cone and you've read Liberation Theology, other Black theologians, in addition to maybe some of the Central American stuff, right? Like, it seems to me, I'm a follower of Jesus. At best, I'm probably a secular Christian. I'm indifferent to the divinity in some ways. It doesn't interest me that much. But how do I put this? It seems to me that the story of the Christ is this story, that spirituality and political life are one and the same. And if you're truly political, you will be spiritual, because you will face consequences that will raise issues with your livelihood, your mortality, right? Specifically as a follower of someone who is challenging power in the form of the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think recovering those readings and rereading Bonhoeffer, and
you tell folks who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was. I mean, he's so pivotal, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was a Lutheran theologian in sort of pre-Nazi Germany, and was someone who ultimately put his life on the line and was killed, for not allowing, at least in his writing, not allowing the church to be completely run through with Nazi ideology and put in the service of a racist, anti-Semitic machine.
Yeah.
And you know, not a popular move.
Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly one that cost him his life at the end of the day.
And
But I think
he got out too. He came
yeah,
to
yeah,
union, came out, he got out of, you know, got out and went back,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Went back. And my understanding is his parents found out about his execution on the radio. Like,
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that. But
yeah, but
yeah,
his I mean, his book was what, The Cost of Discipleship or
yeah, yeah.
something. I mean, it seems to me that we're talking about bearing crosses here.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly about a costly Christianity, right? I mean, but costly in that way that we've been talking about, like
Yeah,
costly, I think,
yeah,
in terms of what you lose, I think, is a comfortable cushion in your average white Christian church.
yeah,
You know, what you gain, I think, is probably your soul.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, at
Well,
the end of the
yeah, yeah,
day.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and that's been the pivotal question to me throughout my life is what, I mean, it's that thing of what happens to me if we don't act, right?
yeah,
That passivity or complicity isn't without damage, right? You know, and I'm not saying that because I always act. I think that's kind of the human struggle,
yeah.
right? And maybe it's the spiritual struggle, you know. Um, I don't know. But
Yeah, it helps me too to think. I don't know if you have kids or not, but I mean, for me, it also does help. That's you know, or you know, even if you don't have kids, the next, what are we passing down to the next
yeah,
generation, right? You know, and I feel like the job of every, I mean, regardless, I think the job of every generation is to kind of take what we've received and do something
yeah,
authentic with it,
yeah,
right? And to do something authentic means you always have to jettison
yeah,
something,
yeah,
right? Because unless you're going to call all of the previous generation saints,
right,
you know,
right.
they screwed something up, they missed
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
right? You
we all
know,
do.
and that's right, and we will too. That's
Yeah,
right, we will too. But to knowingly leave something in our faith that we know to be corrupt and bigoted and wrong, right? Just for the sake of saving face. I mean, that we can't do.
yeah,
And so I think we're thinking about how do we pass along a more authentic faith, you know, to the next generation that for sure is going to be flawed in all the
yeah,
ways, you
yeah,
know, human things will be, but that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to purge it of the things that we know are a distortion.
yeah,
Um, and we know that white supremacy, and the idea that our lives are worth more than others is a deep, deep distortion of the gospel.
yeah. All you have to do is read about Samaritans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But are you as I'm frustrated because I feel like Jesus got hijacked by the evangelicals and weaponized in a way. Like,
You know, I guess, I mean, this is where I guess the sociologist in me kicks in, and
and
you know,
I don't mean that in a personal sense. I mean, there's social
yeah,
forces that cause that to happen, right? It's not personal, right? It's
yeah.
bigger than that. But there's a way that my liberal Christian friends won't take Jesus back.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
Like
No, I think
like folks
that's
have an exclusive claim to it among
yeah,
evangelical folk, like they've colonized it in a way.
yeah. No, I mean that's right, and I think it's part of what I was meaning by saying, you know, we shouldn't give up the central symbols of the faith, right? But uh, they don't have to mean what they meant in Confederate supporting churches, you
Yeah,
know. But we've only barely begun to do that work. I mean, I really think there's a generation's worth of theological spade work to be done here, you know, that's not going to be done by one person. It's going to be done by a generation of people,
yeah,
or it won't.
yeah,
And if it doesn't, I mean, I think, you know, the spade work that'll be done is burying the church.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Two last things, and I'll let you go. But
Yeah,
thank you again for making time for this.
sure.
You know, I think the other thing that gives me a lot of hope is, and I said this the other day, I'm an analog man living in a digital world. Like I'm kind of a Luddite to some degree. Um, but the technology, as things become scanned, as a, you know, as this submerged history by archivists and
Mm,
so forth float up, the truth seems to be floating up. And I can just use one example, the Mary Turner Project. Like, we've been able to provide families with photographs of lynch mob members, simply because of things like ancestry. Now, what happens is that folks are sharing information digitally. They don't know their complete histories, right? And then other folks are making connections. When we talked to UDC folks here and did kind of Confederate stuff, we can pull up the Georgia secession statement where it says slavery 28 times, right? It's right. So I'm totally excited. And I'm not a big tech guy, but this is changing. And of course, it's a double-edged sword in many ways, right? There's that, but this is a powerful. Can you imagine what King and them could have done, or the, labor movement or suffrage movement could have done with social media? It's pretty powerful. The last thing I want to just ask, and it's kind of coming full circle because you attributed your kind of way of seeing things to your folks, but it sounded like that they were so part and parcel of the Southern Baptist world themselves, right? Because you were in church all the time. Like, what do you think made them sensitive in the ways they were about kind of racist language? Because again, that's kind of the $1 million question that I've been grappling with for 30 years. And I've been asked it, I'm sure you've been asked it too, as a white guy, like, by folks of color. They're scratching their head and looking at me like, what's your story? So do you have any ideas of why your parents in Mississippi were like, were there any stories that they shared, or any events that you know about with them that kind of helped them develop that consciousness?
That's a really good question. I'm realizing I don't think I've asked them that question.
Are they still around?
They are, yeah. They're still around. I should really get a fuller, picture of it. I mean, like I said, I know that sort of later I saw them working with, alongside, they were in integrated workplaces, and so I think that probably had a lot to do with it, that they were just rubbing shoulders with, like you said, your examples of your friends in third grade, that kind of just busted up every stereotype so I think, here's my guess, is that has a lot to do with it. It's just that they were in environments in public school and my dad in kind of a small business setting where it was a very integrated, place. And so I think those relationships were probably, at the end of the day, I mean, certainly, reading helps. I mean, journaling helps. But I think the things that often solidify it for us is relationships, right? It's people we know, and maybe it's a good place to maybe even end on that. We could do all that. We could do a lot of work ourselves, but I think at the end of the day, what moves us and really moves us along the spectrum is those relationships. And so when we see something happening like George Floyd's murder, such a horrific thing, and we know people, right, who are African American, like, you just know they're hurt, they're angry, they're discouraged, they're, so it becomes a human response, right? You're not responding to some theoretical thing, you're responding to people, in your life. And I think that makes, a world of difference. And so, along with, I think, all the stuff we're talking about inside of white churches, I mean, I do think we have to do our own work. I think that's for sure. But I do think we've got to be in relationships, that we're not in. And that's the thing that will help it feel less like something that is costing us something, and more like something that's bringing us new life.
Yeah. Liberating us in our own way. Yeah. Well, Robby, thank you so much. I kept you longer than I probably said.
No, that's all right. No, thanks.
Thank you. And thanks for the work you're doing. Do you have another book that'll be out soon, or just doing PRRI work?
I'm working on one actually that's a kind of reader that is on white mass racial violence in America, but and not so much just to kind of document it, although I think that's important, but again, in the spirit of kind of healing and repair. It really is kind of beyond lynching. So it's not just these kind of sites of horrific, lynchings, but it is things that happened where there was one in Atlanta, a kind of massive riot of whites that killed hundreds of African American, dozens or hundreds of African Americans over a period of days. These things happened, in just the initial research I've done, in at least a dozen cities in 10 different states. Again, between those years 1870 and 1930. And so kind of bringing those to light, but also looking at what the communities are doing to heal, right, from those. So not just bring them to light, but what's happening on the ground. Like Tulsa, I'll kind of flag this.
Right.
We're about to hit. We're just about 100 days from the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, where as many as 300 African Americans were killed by kind of roving bands of
Right.
kind of white mobs. And so I think there'll be a kind of reckoning around that. But there's a lot of other names like Rosewood, Florida,
Yeah. Elaine.
Elaine, Arkansas.
Yeah.
That's right. That people don't know. Yeah, you know this history, but I think a lot of people don't. And so trying to bring that forward.
Cool. I've got a list somewhere I'll send you too.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, I would love
Yeah,
to see that.
that'd
Yeah.
be great. Yeah, there's so much great work going on now, and specifically around restorative justice, and
Yep.
again, something deeper than shallow symbolic reconciliation. So
Yep.
anyway, well, thank you, Robby. It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for your
Yeah.
time. I
Great
know
to
you're
talk.
busy. Yeah, and if I can ever be of any help, just let me know. Okay, and I'll send you a link as soon as I post this, so you'll know
Perfect.
where it's at. Okay,
Great.
thank
All right.
you.
Thanks,
Have
Mark.
a good day.
Yep.